Welcome back. This is Unit 2.2, and we're talking about comprehension theories. As I said earlier, we're still in this particular piece or puzzle piece, and we talked about propositions. Now we're going to talk about some specific theories of comprehension. Before we talk about the three specific theories of comprehension that we're interested in for this particular class, just to reiterate, quickly review what we learned from the first unit, Unit 2.1, about the common assumptions of comprehension theories. The common assumption is that when you read a text or listen to a conversation or watch something, our mind extracts meaning because we're interested in reading. So let's talk about text. When you read a text, our mind extracts meaning from what we read. This extracted meaning is then represented in our minds. And this representation itself, if it is held for a long time, would form a part of our long-term memory. So the idea is that we extract meaning from the text, represent that meaning from extracted from the text in our mind in the form of propositions. And we looked at what propositions are. Propositions are the simplest idea units, and we talked about three different ways of representing propositions. Now let's talk about, these are general assumptions about comprehension theories. Now let's talk about three influential specific theories of comprehension. Well, in that sense, the outcomes for this particular unit, 2.2, are we'll first talk about embodied theories of cognition. Again, these are not individual theories we are talking about. These are a set of theories. So there are embodied theories of cognition. Then there are event comprehension theories. And then we have text representation theories. And we're going to talk about one for each of those theories. And first, we'll talk about embodied cognition theories in the next slide. So each of the theories we'll talk about have some specific assumptions. Now, let's talk about embodied cognition and its assumptions. And before that, just imagine you're reading a sentence like this. Tom was slicing tomatoes with a knife. What comes to your mind when you read a sentence like that? Most of the people report that they imagine, they kind of simulate a situation where tomatoes are being cut with a knife. In fact, research also suggests that when you read a sentence like that, the parts of the brain related to actually holding a knife also get activated. Not to an extent that you actually physically cut it, but to some subthreshold level, your brain parts get activated. So the idea of embodied cognition at a fundamental level is that when we read something or experience something or hear something or watch something, you process it, understand it with a purpose. And the purpose is to react and interact with the object. In other words, when you're reading the Tom was slicing tomatoes with a knife, you're actually embodied in that scene of someone cutting tomatoes. So you will simulate the situation in your head so that you're ready to interact with knife, tomato, or anything of that sort. Does it make sense? So embodied cognition assumes that that our body is embodied in what we process. So we kind of create a simulation of the events described, and we become a part of this particular simulation. In other words, when we represent the meaning extracted from what we are reading, according to this theory, these representations are not mere propositions or a network of propositions, but there is more to these propositions. It involves activation of the motor and sensory areas in the brain, which gives us this embodied experience of the described situation, as opposed to just a mere abstract level propositional representation of the information described in the book. Does it make sense? Okay, we'll take another example in the next slide and kind of elaborate on that point about embodied cognition, what it is we mean when we say it is embodied. Okay, let's look at another example here. Do you watch horror movies, or have you ever watched a horror movie? Well, I don't like horror movies. My wife loves it. I don't know why she does. What is the point? You're gonna get scared anyways. Why to pay someone to get scared? Anyways, so what happens when you watch a horror movie or any movie as such, especially horror movies? You get scared, correct? Now, just imagine if you're watching that at home on your TV, there's no point for you to get scared, correct? Because whatever you're seeing out there is actually in the television. In fact, you're not a part of that particular event that is being unfolded on your television. So there is no need for you to react, to get startled. But yet we do that. correct? So the idea is whatever we are processing, including the horror movie here you're watching, you are processing it with a purpose to react with objects, in this case, this person or ghost, whatever it is, that is described in the event. Make sense? So the purpose is to react and interact with the object described in the situation. Just imagine reading something. Even then, you feel startled sometimes. The idea is that you just don't extract the meaning from what you read, but you also feel that you're a part of the description that you're reading. And that's what is called embodied, so that you can interact with the things described in the situation. Okay, so we are here. The second outcome here, we're going to talk about the second theory of comprehension, a set of theories of comprehension. And of those, there's like event comprehension theories. The idea is that when you read, especially um, narratives, narratives are kinds of texts that describe some stories, like your novels or examples of narratives. Typically, these stories describe some events. Right. And this particular event, this set of theories of event comprehension lay the foundation to how we might extract information, meaningful information, from when reading stories of this sort. So the idea is that when there is an event, there are some specific aspects to the event, like what is the action that is unfolded, who is the actor unfolding the action, who is receiving the action, where is this action taking place, and when is this action taking place, or has it already taken place, or is going to take place in future. So part of the idea is that we extract these components from what we read as a part of your propositional extraction and representation. Make sense? Now, we'll not go in detail, but when we talked about proposition, we did talk about these aspects, remember? So that's what it refers to. But there is a specifically another specific theory that we'll talk about here called mental model theories, and that's what we'll do, proposed by Johnson Lade's mental model theories, and that's what we'll do in the next slide. So Johnson Lade proposed this theory of mental models, and the theory he proposed was specific to uh, um, problem solving and reasoning, and it equally applies to text comprehension. Now, here is the idea. As we've already discussed, according to theories of comprehension in general, we extract meaning from what we read in the form of propositions, and we store those propositions in our head as a network of propositions. Okay, in that sense, whatever we are extracting from what we are reading is basically a network of propositions. Okay, oh, wait a second, I'm going to talk about something else here now. Let's say my daughter. I love my daughter. Okay. She right now she turned 7 last week. She's this week actually. I love her. I don't know, but I think she actually takes advantage of the fact that I listen to her whatever she says. Well, let's stop it here. Earlier, before I brought the topic of my daughter to our conversation, what was I talking about? Well, I was talking about theories of comprehension in general and how these theories assume that we extract propositions, correct? Then suddenly I switched the topic and I started talking about my daughter. Even here, you have extracted the meaning conveyed in whatever little information I gave you. So when you are extracting propositions from the lecture I'm giving you, the question is, do you create a big network of all the propositions that you have extracted or not? The answer is not, according to mental models theory. The mental models theory assumes that you group together propositions and form a complex propositional network of those events that are related. So everything I talked to you about till about the theories of comprehension, they were part of one mental model. And the moment I changed the topic and started talking about my daughter, then even then you extracted propositions related to the meaning or the idea that how my daughter is beautiful, how she takes advantage of me and things like those, but you group them separately in a different mental model. That's the idea. So the idea of mental models theory is that we create mental models that are described in the situation that you're reading, but these propositions are not just list of propositions, but there is a network of propositions. In other words, you create a mental model, which is a network of propositions. However, each mental model that you create is a unique combination of a related propositions. Anything that is not related to the discussed topic would be added to another mental model. Make sense? So we kind of create these bubbles in our head, which are networks of propositions, and these bubbles only contain those propositions related to the topic or related to a topic, or somehow all these propositions in one mental model are related. So the propositions here are related, the propositions here are related, the propositions here are related. Of course, the examples here is not appropriate or not saying anything here. But the idea is that we create subsets or sub mental models depending on the topic. Okay, that brings us to the last theory of comprehension, and it's proposed by Kinshin Van Dyke in '83, and we can call these theories as theories of text representation. Now, if you if you think of the other two theories we have described so far, right? These theories are talking about how the mental models are created or what is in the mental model, or it's talking about the fact that there are more than just propositions in the mental models you create. Now, this particular set of theories, or this particular theory as such, it is about the product of comprehension. In other words, when you read a text, let's say you read a paragraph or a page or you read a chapter from a book, we know in general that we extract a meaning from what you read in the form of propositions and store that in you form mental models and you store that in your mind, right? Well, I had to stop there, pause for a moment because my dog, as you know, her name is Minnie. So, according to this theory of text representation, talks about the mental models that we have created that we store in our mind. What is the nature of it? What is the structure of it? What is in that representation? That's why this is called theory of representation. It talks about what is in the product in our mind that we have represented as a result of whatever reading you're doing at any given point of time. According to this theory of text representation, we kind of create three different representations. Now, just imagine um, a representation is a structure of meaning that we have extracted from the text, and now it is a part of our mind. So that's what we're talking about. Now, at a general level, you can think of these as mental models. So these are basically mental models, or we'll call them representations of the meaning that is gathered from whatever you're reading. So according to this theory, there are three different levels of representation that we form when we read something. Again, we form three different layers or levels of representation of the same information you're reading at the same time. In other words, you have representation one. Again, in any order, it doesn't matter which one comes first. All three are represented in our mind at the same time. The first one is called surface form, the second one is called text space, and the third one is called situation model. Again, what are these? These are representations of the information you have captured or created when reading something. And you can classify as we can think of it as three different representations or three different levels of representation. In the next slide, we'll talk about the surface form level representation, then we'll talk about text-based representation, and then we'll talk about the situation model representation. Again, just to make it clear, these are representations of the information or the meaning that is gathered or from what you're reading. The surface form representation is the representation of the meaning that is conveyed in the text that you've just read. So if you remember the Galileo text, you remember the events described in it, correct? But at some point, at least immediately of reading the text, you also remembered the exact wording there was in that particular text. So this level of representation has not only meaning, but it also has syntax, exact wording. So meaning and syntax, both these aspects are held. So let's say you take another example. Let's say you met someone at a restaurant and you had a conversation, and the conversation you had, mostly you have a word to word representation. Let's say it's a quick 2-minute conversation So you have a word-to-word representation of that conversation, at least for some time. That word-to-word representation, including the meaning of the word-to-word representation, is what is called as surface form representation. So that if somebody asks, "Hey, what were you talking?" you would be able to, if need be, give a verbatim account of the conversation. Like, I said this, he said this, blah blah blah. So that level of representation is called surface form. But the problem with this is that if I ask you the same question after a week, you won't remember. In fact, after an hour, you may be able to summarize what happened in the conversation, but not give the exact word to word verbatim information. In other words, the surface level representation is quickly lost, in fact, in seconds. Okay, that's the surface form representation. There is the second one called text based, and that's what we'll talk about in the next slide. Okay, coming to the second level of representation called the text-based representation. This level of representation does not include the exact wording. It only retains the meaning that is conveyed in the text. Just imagine you're reading a story and you took like an hour to read the story and somebody asked you, "Hey, what is the story about?" Well, you may be able to remember everything in whatever you have read in 1 hour and describe it, but keep in mind that you may not be able to describe it word to word as it is described in the book you just read, but you are mostly paraphrasing, explaining it. All right. So text-based representation is more like a representation of meaning, more like paraphrasing. And this kind of information is held for a little longer time than surface form. If the surface form information is lost in seconds, text-based information may be lost in for longer than seconds, minutes, or hours. But it is held. Keep in mind, let's say you've read a story that has 100 ideas. You may remember all the 100 ideas, the meaning of those 100 ideas, or the paraphrases of those 100 ideas for some time. And that's what text-based representation is. So text-based representation, it retains the meaning. You forget the wording. It is retained for a little longer. But even this information gets lost. So that most of the ideas that you have represented, the meaning of, is lost, but you only retain the most important ones, or most important events described. Okay, that brings us to the next level of representation, the situation model representation. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. Okay, so coming to the situation model representation. Now, this is the representation level that is the deepest level of representation. This level of representation, it retains the meaning of the explicit ideas that are discussed in the story you're reading, but not all the ideas. They only retain the meaning specific to some ideas, the paraphrases. So when we say meaning, think of paraphrases. So you do remember some events, but you don't remember all the events described in the story. And you remember them not word to word, but you remember them in terms of paraphrasing, in terms of meaning conveyed in those particular stories. But an important part of a situation model is the fact that it has inferences. Now, what is an inference? An inference is the information or meaning that is not directly, or explicitly stated in the text, but the information is something that you that you have extracted by reading a text. And that could be by connecting the information, like two different informations in the text, or by connecting the information in the text with what you already know in your background. So these kind of new information that you've generated are called inferences. And if you take the example, and I'm going to pause here and I'll re-record another part of it, just so it's an important point. At the same time, I want you to give bits and pieces of information as opposed to just throw everything in one slide. So I'm going to pause here and I'll re-record additional points related to this level of representation. So let's look at an example. Have you read Harry Potter? Well, I guess you have. Do you remember? Do you remember uh, the story from? I don't know. I have not read this yet. Like series one. Do you remember the story? Can you summarize me? Are you talking about each and every event that happened in that particular series? I bet not. Right? It's impossible. Right? Now you only remember some important events that were unfolded in that series. Right? So that's the point. You retain only meaning of some of the events because it has become a part of your situation model. And situation model representation is a representation that is retained for a long time. Then the other thing is, let's imagine you're reading for the first time, then you're reading for the second time. When you read for the second time, the kind of information that you generate that is not directly stated in the book is much more rich and when compared to if you're reading it for the first time, because you know some background knowledge about the stuff already, and on a second reading you're able to better appreciate some words that are used in the book. Make sense? It is because you're connecting your background knowledge to this information that is in the text in your second reading. So that's the kind of inferencing I'm talking about, which is one kind of inferencing. It's called elaboration. What is that? Elaboration. Like you're taking this class now. Maybe you've taken a physio class, or maybe you've taken a psycholinguistic class. And then you're trying to make connections between the ideas that are discussed here with the ideas that were discussed in the other class. Then you're coming up with this new idea called inference of how these are related, or you may come up with a new idea of a totally different type. These are inferences of a specific kind called elaboration. There is another kind of inference where one part of the text talks about something and another part of the text talks about something. Then it requires you to connect these two particular parts to come up with this new idea. I bet that is that. You know what I'm saying? So that is a text level inference. It's called bridging inference. A bridging inference is the inference that's formed as a result of connecting two text elements. An elaboration is an inference that is drawn by connecting the text elements with your background knowledge information. So here's a question. If you're taking a class and learning some information, at what level you think we want you to retain the information? Do you think we want you to remember the exact wording of what you teach? I bet not, right? Or do we want you to remember all the facts that we gave you? Not really, unless like there are some specific things that I want to remember, but that's not all we want, right? We really don't care if you not remember every fact that you might have learned from the book. What we really want is, at least I really want you to do, is have this rich understanding of the topic, correct? So we want you to have a richer understanding of the topic discussed. So we expect you to have a situation model representation. Also because it is retained for a long time. In fact, the more you use the information that you have stored, the richer and richer it becomes, just like reading the book for third, fourth time. Okay, so that brings us to the end of Unit 2. In the next unit, we'll talk about comprehension processes, and then we'll talk about the puzzles. Thank you very much.